Hi everyone, welcome. As you can see on the label, I've got a number of different types of worms living in this system here. I've got red wigglers, European night crawlers, and blue worms, affectionately referred to as our mixed red worms. And when you see a piece of cardboard that's about this size, a lot of times you can already tell what I'm preparing to do. Today we're going to begin the migration of the worms out of their finished castings, and I think they're due for that already. It's been a while now since we set them up on foraging, which means they've received no new bedding. The bedding that the system was built from originally, when the system was launched, is a whole bunch of twine that I had. Kind of unusual. And at this point, there's just little itsy bitsy scraps of that twine remaining, but not enough, I think, to keep going with the foraging. I think it's time to initiate the migration of the worms out of their finished castings. This system is already, at this point, with the exception of my Vermibag Mini, the oldest of my active systems. These systems up here already completed their migration. That's what the inverted labels indicate over here. So I think we're ready to get these little guys started on the evacuation of their finished castings. We'll set up a little divider, set up a nice horizontal migration feeding zone, and let them get started with that. So I'm going to put on a glove, get the system up on the bench, and we're going to get to work. Let's get started. So the age of the bin, 294 days, which is 42 weeks, makes up a two-phase breakdown of 186 days of composting with bedding and 108 days foraging without bedding. And there have been 24 feedings. Technically what we're doing at this point, I don't even treat as the food that made up all the castings that were produced in this system. At this point, as far as I'm concerned, this is the product of 24 feedings. Any of the feedings that go in after this, such as today's feeding, which is going to be already for the purpose of getting the worms to migrate, this stuff will probably end up just going with the worms. You know, it's not like we're going to take the castings get developed in the horizontal migration feeding zone and try to harvest those castings. Those castings, whatever amount gets produced in the horizontal migration feeding zone, will simply go with the worms to their new home. And here we've got a feeding zone indicator over the edge of the bin where we fed. You know, for some time now we set the system up in a wedge configuration. So in a way the worms have already been getting lured over to the edge of the bin, this edge of the bin where the feeding zone was, and this side of the bin has not gotten fed for a number of check-ins, but there's probably still plenty of worms hanging out in this stuff because, yeah, look at that, lots of worms hanging out in this stuff because the stuff is pretty damp still. I had switched from plastic covers to just the newspaper cover that you saw a moment ago to try to let the system start losing some of its moisture content to evaporation. But I'm starting to wonder if we might be best off at this point just leaving no covers to let the system on this edge of the bin really start drying off, so that the worms will have a little bit of an extra bit of motivation to want to leave the material and make their way over into the edge of the bin that we're trying to lure them into to facilitate their haul out. So we've already kind of aerated the edge of the bin furthest away from where the horizontal migration feeding zone is going to get set up, because I'm just going to set it up on the same edge that we've been feeding ever since we set it up in the wedge configuration. And I figured as long as I'm kind of going through here, anything I find like this larger object, you know, I'm going to put this down, but you can see I've perforated the little divider that we're going to use to separate the lovely finished castings from the vermicompost. So anything I find, larger bits of stuff, we'll just include it in the collection of foods that we're going to use to set up the horizontal migration feeding zone. I've got coffee, I've got cantaloupe melon rind, I've got watermelon rind, and a frozen block of strawberry and blackberries. And it's a pretty good amount of food there. Stuff that I assume is going to definitely pique the interest of the worms to make them come over and want to check it out. Not to mention the fact that the horizontal migration feeding zone is going to be loaded with nice fresh new bedding, which the worms have not seen any of in over 100 days. And I guess the other thing I was kind of looking for here as we went through, although we've already kind of gone tilling through this material a number of times in the past and not found any, was just any sort of residual bits of twine that might still be lingering in here. I figured that could also just be included in the horizontal migration feeding zone, so that what's left out here is really just finished castings. This is a chunk of a avocado pit. Here and there, there's just going to be little bits of residual stuff in this material. Like I said earlier, I figured it would be a good opportunity to just pluck those items out so that we can really consider what's on this edge of the bin as finished castings, just waiting depopulation so that it could be harvested. And then over on this edge of the bin is where we're going to be trying to get the worms to come over to. Now I know there's a bunch of other things over here, so I mean I've kind of cheated, right? Let's just keep going a little bit more systematically here in terms of going across the entire length of the system here. That would make the most sense, I suppose. Kind of gradually picking a spot and then inspecting the material to see how it looks, possibly removing any sort of residual leftover food bits, slow going food bits. Seems like we must have had an avocado pit in here that got shattered and went to pieces. So I just found a couple more chunks of it over here. But other than that, I've been finding little else. I kind of thought we might see a little bit of twine. There's also a piece of string in here that I wanted to extract. A piece of string that I put in here, I believe, prior to the start of foraging, so meaning over 100 days ago. String which I thought was some sort of a natural fiber, but it just hasn't really changed in appearance other than getting kind of brown from being in this material. But as far as showing signs of breakdown, it appears to me like it's possibly a synthetic type of a string, which will probably not break down, so I thought it was time to exclude it. You know, if we really wanted to kind of push the envelope on that stuff and just continue to give it the benefit of the doubt and see if it eventually starts to break down, we could just include it in the horizontal migration feeding zone. But I think I've been patient enough with that stuff, and just the fact that it hasn't changed in appearance whatsoever tells me it's probably not going to break down. But we just kept throwing it into the feeding zone where we knew there'd be a lot of worm traffic, and we figured if it's going to break down, then that's the place where it's going to happen. But since it hasn't, I think now is the time to exclude it, along with these large fragments of food items. You're probably already recognizing what these other large food items are here. They're it's hard to imagine that you would consider them as food. They're more like experimental objects. I mean, eventually it definitely breaks down just like everything else, but they're slow going. Pumpkin stems, 2 of them over here. And then, you know, here's that piece of string. That string that I thought would break down. I thought it might have been made out of cotton, but it must be something else because it just hasn't changed. I'm going to leave it out here in the bright lights so that the worms that are occupying it right now will try to get out of the lights and leave it, and then we'll be able to extract it. In the meantime, we'll just continue checking through here to see what else we find. Oh, another slow composting large item, a mango seed, which during the past few check-ins I've attempted to squeeze to see if it would crack open, but it has refused to do so, so it's just going to get included in the feeding zone as well. And at this point, man, this stuff is so damp and sticky. And this is definitely a crowded bin. We definitely saw a lot of worms as we plowed through this material. I sort of do remember little itsy bitsy remaining lingering bits of twine that I definitely saw. Like, I think this might be twine right here, as is this. But I really suspected that anything we found at this point that was still residual actual twine that will eventually break down was probably so far gone at this point that continuing with the foraging at this point just for the sake of watching that stuff break down was kind of ridiculous anymore. And yeah, you know, I think leaving this material completely uncovered is going to be the only way to let it dry. I don't even know how long it's been, probably 4, perhaps 5 check-ins, I don't know, maybe 3, I don't know. It was a few check-ins ago that we removed the plastic coverings off this thing, replacing it with that newspaper in the hope that by doing so we would allow the material in here to be able to more readily dry through evaporation. But that too seems like it just didn't really happen very much. So you can see this is a pizza box. So corrugated cardboard, and let's see. I'll put this little lip on the bottom so that it would sort of serve as a little bit of a extra bit of protection to help keep the bedding with which we're creating the horizontal migration feeding zone in the feeding zone and not let it contaminate these lovely castings, which are going to get harvested eventually. And now we can come in with my prepared bedding. So these little guys, I think they're going to appreciate having some nice fresh bedding to crawl around in, even when we were still giving them bedding way back when. We were also, in a way, expecting that the leftovers of the twine were also serving as a bedding source. So let's also throw in this old feeding zone indicator as supplemental bedding, because we have a nice replacement for it right here, which we'll set aside after we empty the coffee out of it. And then this right here is going to become our replacement feeding zone indicator. Although, you know, when it comes to a horizontal migration feeding zone, it's quite obvious where the feeding zone is, or at least it seems pretty obvious to me with the big divider that I put out there. And you know, the cardboard and paper and leaf mixture that my prepared bedding is made up out of, it is prepared with moisture. But the stuff definitely doesn't have a lot of moisture, so I wanted it to be nice and cozy and damp down here for them. So I'm throwing in a little bit of water so that this stuff down here can really get nice and damp. And then we can start coming in with all of this stuff. I mean, this big pile of berries, frozen chunks of strawberry and blackberry, I think is going to also emit a good bit of moisture as it starts to thaw out. So this will further dampen the bedding down low. And perhaps we can even come in with a bit more. I mean, some people might even say, hey, that's a lot of berry right there. Maybe you don't even need any more food than that. But as you saw, this is a pretty heavily populated system. Lots and lots of worms in here. I have a feeling that they're going to have no problem working their way through even a generous portion of food. So we're gonna be generous with the bedding, generous with the food, and hopefully by doing so we're going to convince a whole bunch of worms to come on over into the horizontal migration feeding zone, and more importantly, stay in the horizontal migration feeding zone. Yeah, that looks pretty nice to me. Looks like a little piece of something went flying over here. Now, let's not forget, we've got some cantaloupe here too. I'm even wondering if perhaps just a little bit more bedding might be in order, just to get everything covered up over here. And this will be our horizontal migration feeding zone. You know, let's just use some of this existing bedding. I don't know if we need to make the horizontal migration feeding zone much bigger than this. I would like to, now that we've built it, I'd like to nudge it over a little bit further so that we could leave a little bit more space for this material out here to get spread out over a larger area, because by being so thick I suspect that it's gonna have a hard time drying off. So I figured if we can level off. Ooh, let's not forget we wanted to get rid of this stuff here too, right? Looks like most worms have made their way out of it already, except for this little guy. Alright, let's just leave it out here on the surface for one more moment. You know, I think we are going to leave the newspaper off, the finished castings, to let the material out on this edge of the bin start to dry a little bit more easily than if it were covered with newspaper. So yeah, I think we could just leave that string out here on the surface, and it'll definitely become worm-free just by being out here in the light. And I guess since we've got that piece of newspaper sitting here, and it wasn't going to go back over the finished castings, perhaps this stuff could be folded over a couple times and become the cover for our horizontal migration feeding zone, hopefully protecting it from losing its moisture content by being covered up this way. I mean, at the very least we've got 4 layers of paper, but in certain places where it's already folded over we've got numerous additional layers of paper there. And I guess if the feeding zone starts to seem like it's drying out, we could always protect it with plastic, but I think for now we should be okay. So that begins the horizontal migration of the mixed red worms out of their finished castings, and at some point in the near future we'll be back to check on them. I mean, we're only less than a week away from the system hitting 300 days of age. I do wonder if perhaps, you know, even though it doesn't seem like a great deal of time, only 6 days, maybe we will just come back in here to make sure everything's working okay, and then at the same time kind of recognize their 300th day in service. Who knows, maybe even add food if it looks like they've worked it down enough to need more. So that's it for a check-in with the mixed red worms at this point in their 3rd phase. Composting is done, foraging is done. Now we begin with the migration. So that's it for the check-in, everyone. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. It's really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.